Way. Thank you so much. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon or assalamu alaikum, مساء الخير. This is Hanem El-Farahaty, a BRISMES Council member and an associate professor of Arabic language, translation and interpreting at the University of Leeds. I'm also one of the members of the BRISMES Subcommittee for Education and Outreach and Pedagogy. So I'm so delighted to welcome you all to this panel on contemporary Arabic literature and translation. This panel is organized, as I said, by the BRISMES Outreach Subcommittee. I welcome our valued speakers today, and I thank them all for all their time and accepting our invitation and their contribution to the panel today. Before I hand on to Abdel-Wahab, I just wanted to run you through some housekeeping stuff. I know we're not face-to-face, but I always call it housekeeping. So the event will be 2 hours long, and we will record the first hour, the presenters' presentations, and then we will stop the recording in the discussion in the second hour. And I will ask you please to mute yourselves whilst the speakers are speaking, and try and also write your questions in the chat if you can in the meantime, and we will have a close eye on the chat and get to answer your questions in the second hour. So without further ado, I wanted to shift slightly to Arabic because I really wanted to do this in Arabic, but I am aware some of you might not speak Arabic. So I just wanted to welcome you in Arabic so quickly, and I'm not going to speak all the time in English. Just say that أرحب بكم جميعا وأشكركم على حضوركم ومشاركتكم في هذه الندوة الكبيرة، وأشكر جميع المتحدثين من كتاب ومترجمين وأكاديميين لتلبيتهم دعوتنا للحديث عن الأدب العربي والترجمة في الحقبة الأخيرة وما نجم عنها من تطورات وتغييرات في الأدب العربي وترجمته. So now I hand over to Abdel-Wahab, my colleague, who will lead the panel and also the discussion. And a few words about Abdel-Wahab. Abdel-Wahab Khalifa is a lecturer in translation and interpreting at Cardiff University. Prior to joining Cardiff, he lectured at universities in Egypt, Austria, and the UK. He has also worked as a professional translator and interpreter for several years. Among other degrees, he holds a PhD in translation studies and Arabic from the University of Leeds and MPhil in translation and interpreting from the University of Salford. He is the Harry Ransom Fellow in Humanities until between 2019 and 2023, and a member of the Executive Board of the Association for Translation Studies in Africa, and a member of IATS as well. I have a lot to say about Abdel-Wahab, so I just try to make it briefer for time constraints. But I hand over to you, Abdel-Wahab, and thank you for leading it and for joining us as well.
Thank you so much, Hanem, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be working with you and colleagues on this. And I extend the welcome to all the audience. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll have a lovely talk. So the event will have 2 parts. Just a little bit about the structure. In the first part, each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes each. So they will be talking to us about the recent developments in the field as they see it. So what has happened in the last decade or 2, the good developments in the field, but also the challenges that they see or foresee in the field. And then some of them will also read just a little bit of some of their work. It could be literary work, or they can talk to us about part of the research in the 10 minutes that they have been allocated. And then the second hour will be allocated to your questions. We had also received questions from colleagues and students and people that have emailed us. So in case we run out of time, we would be able to ask our speakers to respond to these if they can, but if not, we'll just try to answer as many as possible during the event. So our first speaker is Leila Aboulela. So I'll just a few words of introduction about Leila, although she doesn't need an introduction. So Leila Aboulela is an award-winning author who was born in Egypt, grew up in Sudan, and moved to Aberdeen in her 20s. She's the author of 5 novels, among which are The Translator, which won the, I think it was a New York Times 100 Notable Books of the Year, and Minaret and Lyrics Alley, which won Fiction Prize of the Scottish Book Awards. So Leila was the first winner of the Caine Prize for African Writing, and her latest short story collection, Elsewhere Home, won the Salter Fiction Book of the Year award. Leila's work has been translated into 15 languages, and she also was longlisted 3 times for the Orange Prize for Fiction. She also writes plays, and her plays The Insider and The Mystic Life and others were broadcast on BBC Radio, and her fiction included in publications such as Freeman's, Granta and Harper's Magazine. Leila, pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Hanem. Thank you, Dr. Abdel-Wahab, for this introduction. I'm going to share my screen today. I'm also going to maybe add to the introduction by saying that all my work has been translated into Arabic as well. So my talk is going to be about recent and forthcoming Sudanese literature in translation. And actually recent, I took it to mean the last couple of years. So it's not the last decade, it's actually just very, very recent translation. And my opinion, or my conclusion in what I'm going to present is that when Sudanese literature is translated into English, it becomes somehow to the reader, to in the world, it becomes African, and it links the Arab identity to the African identity, and it opens new spaces for the work itself, for the writer itself, and also the current generation of Sudanese writers seem to be more and more assertive of their African identity. And a precursor to all of this is, of course, how Tayyip Saleh's Season of Migration to the North was first published by the Hanem and African Writers series rather than the Hanem and Arab Writers series. And this is how Season of Migration reached African audiences. It's taught as an African text. And so somehow or the other, Sudanese writers, once they become translated into to English, follow in that way. Okay, so first up is Birth, a selection of short stories by Abdulaziz Baraka Sakin. It's published in 2021. It's published by Willow's House, which is a publisher based in Juba in South Sudan. So there is they are Sakin's regular publishers, a decision that he made, that he's comfortable, with having a publisher in South Sudan. This is his preference. The stories are translated by a number of translators, Anne Borrell, Adel Babikr, Nancy Robert, Lamia Shammat, and others. Abdulaziz Baraka Sakin is one of Sudan's top authors, and the French translation of his work won the 2020 prize for French translated Arab novels. That's for his novel, The Jungle. And also the French translation of the novel was nominated for another prize that's specifically for African writers, and he was shortlisted alongside his book, was shortlisted alongside books by top African writers such as Chigozie Obioma, Britt Bennett, and Bernardine Evaristo. Sakin's writing is exhilarating to read. It's full of exuberance. He writes particularly well about women, and he writes about the cultures of West Sudan, which we don't really know much about. So he opens up this world to us. We're mostly we know a lot about North Sudan, or the capital. And so he opens up this world of West Sudan for us. In all of his writers, his characters are relentlessly attacked. There's a great deal of suffering, but they stand firm in their humanity, and this makes him exhilarating to read. Although his books are bestsellers in Sudan and they've been translated into some European languages, they're not easily available in English, unfortunately. Yeah. So next is The Drowning by Hamur Ziada, and it was published last month by Interlink Books in the United States. And the translator is Paul Starkey. I read this novel just last weekend. I found it very gripping. I couldn't put it down once I started it. Hamur Ziada is a dramatist at heart, and the novel opens with the appearance of a drowned body on the shores of a village which is next to the Nile. Ziada has this, he handles this large cast of men and women, and we get to know them throughout the novel. I must admit I had trouble following the family relations between the characters, and I found that the translation of, I wished I had the Arabic version so I could see whether the uncle was a khal or am, and whether the sister-in-law was the wife of the brother, or the wife of the wife of the brother of the brother, or I don't know. Anyway, it's I'm getting confused. Anyway, what I meant to say is that these words uncle and sister-in-law in English aren't as useful as the original Arabic, and somehow when translating we should maybe do something about that. Okay, Hamur, just to say about Hamur Ziada that you might have seen his work in the Oscar-nominated Sudanese film You Will Die at 20, and it was based on one of his short stories. He also, his novel The Longing of the Dervish won the Najib Mahfouz prize a couple of years ago. Okay, this is now on to the forthcoming. This is The Beauty Hunters, Sudanese Bedouin Poetry, Evolution Impact, with a focus on the Butana region by Adel Babikr, is due for publication in the spring of 2023 by the University of Nebraska Press. And this will be the inaugural monograph in the new On Africa Poetry series edited by Kwame Dawies and Matthew Shinoda. So this is clearly, an African publication, and it's a research. It's the first of its kind to appear, and it gives us this rare insight into Sudanese Bedouin poetry, its aesthetics and its impact. The focus of the book is on one poet, Al-Hardallo, who is Sudan's preeminent 19th century poet, and Al-Hardallo's legacy is captured, with thoroughness by Adel Babikr, and we see, dancing women and orcs blazing through this vivid landscape of nomadic tribes and journeys under the stars. And really, this is an exciting publication. And Adel Babikr captures the exuberance of this particular poet who's caught in the crosshairs of imperialism. And also the study shows us how Arabic has mixed with the local Beja and the Nubian languages of Africa. Next up is also forthcoming, inshallah, in June 2023. I'm very excited about this. I haven't read it yet. It's Stella Gaetano's novel, Ido's Souls, published by Sawad Hussein. The novel is a winner of a Penn Translates Award, and it's the first time that such an award goes to a South Sudanese writer. Ido's Souls is described as a South Sudanese folkloric historical novel, and that explores motherhood, and it's set against the backdrop of civil war. So Stella Gaetano, unlike the other writers, she's not an Arab. She's an African writer from South Sudan, but she writes in Arabic. And this is because she was born in Khartoum in the north. She's a daughter of refugees from the Lutaka tribe who moved away from the south to the north as a consequence of the civil war. Stella Gaetano's writing, I've read her previous work, is steered with the experience of dislocation, and her characters are characters who are marginalized because of race or because of poverty. So this is an exciting publication, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And then to end my talk is my own novel. To tell you about it. It's going to be published in March 23, inshallah. And it's about a young South Sudanese girl who comes of age during the Mahdist wars in 19th century Sudan. So it's a historical novel set at the time of the Mahdi's revolution. And it leads up, it covers the years leading up to the British invasion of Sudan. So that's me done, and look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila.
Okay.
So we'll now move to our second speaker, Professor Reem Bassiouney. So just a bit of introduction about Reem. So Professor Reem Bassiouney is the chair of the Department of Applied Linguistics at the American University in Cairo. She obtained her MPhil and doctorate from Oxford University in the UK, and she has previously taught at universities in the UK as well as the US, and she's currently the serious editor for the Routledge Studies in Language and Identity. In addition to her academic work, Reem is also an award-winning novelist, having received the King Fahd Prize for translation for her novel, The Pistachio Seller, in 2009, and the SOAS Prize for Best Novel in 2010. I believe she's also launching a new novel today. Congratulations, Reem, and good luck with that, and over to you.
Thank you so much for including me. I'm very honored, and I'm very happy to be with all of you, and I know you all from your work. More than anything else. So it's good to see you all in person today. It's sort of very challenging for me to speak about my own experience usually, but I just want to explain to you sort of stages in my writing career, which I think are very important. I've started writing novels when I was 12 years old, and thought that I have to get published at the age of 15 or 16, which of course was a very ambitious plan on my part that never took place. I started publishing short stories in Egypt when I was 21, and then stopped writing and did my PhD and was concentrating on linguistics for about 10 years even. And then after that, I decided to rewrite one of my oldest novels. After rewriting the old novel that I had, I put it aside and wrote a new one. And that was sort of brought me back to my career of writing. And the new one that I wrote was called The Smell of the Sea, Ra'ihat al-Bahr. In 2005, this was the first novel that I published in 2005. It hasn't been translated into English. It was easy, sort of not very difficult for me to publish at that point. However, there were a lot of frustrations in the publishing field in Egypt at the time. There were certain authors that were, sort of, they didn't mean to, but they were monopolizing the scene simply because they were selling more at the time. This has somehow changed over time. At the moment, I think we're having a very interesting and very promising bloom in the history of Egypt in terms of publishing and reading. And the reason for that is that we are having a lot of book clubs, new book clubs by young people. We're having, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter has made it easier for people to speak about the books they read, to boast about how many books they read each year, which is something, again, that we didn't necessarily have before. Anyway, going back to my story about myself, I wrote 5 novels, won 2 prizes. 3 of my novels at the time were translated into English. The Pistachio Seller won a prize, and then Professor Hanem was translated into different languages. And then after that, the novel Ashya Ra'i'a, which was translated into Mortal Designs. That was 2010. So for 5 years, I wrote 5 novels, which is quite good. And then I stopped writing altogether for 7 years, which I think, I call it a writer's block. And it was a very frustrating writer's block because I thought that I don't have anything else to say. Possibly that is the end of my career as a writer. I can just concentrate on my academic work. It could also be that there were so many things happening around us in the Arab world, from 2010, there's 2011, the revolution in Egypt, and then things have changed so much that it was difficult for me as someone who belongs to this area to digest everything that was happening. Perhaps I needed more time to actually think and digest everything that was happening. It took me another 7 years before I started writing again. I always remember this with a lot of fear, hoping that this will not happen again, that I will have such a long writer's block. But I am one of these people who believe that if you don't have anything to say, it's better not to write. If you don't have a passion inside you for conveying a certain story and a certain emotions or feelings or even message, then perhaps one shouldn't force oneself to write. Anyway, so what brought me to writing again was a kind of very different experience. It was my experience with history, a history that for a long time I put aside and thought was not important at all in my life as an Egyptian. And unfortunately, we may all do that in our life, where we think that the history of our country has parts that are very interesting and light and wonderful, and parts that we don't want to remember because they are not interesting for us or they are not important for us. And unfortunately, we are doing this all the time, sort of choosing and picking the parts that we like about history and letting go of the parts we don't like. While in reality, by doing that, we are actually throwing away treasures of our own identity and of understanding who we actually are. It all happened when I went to a visit to Islamic Cairo for the first time, and I'm very sad to say that, at the age of 40, for the first time. I went to the mosque of Sultan Hassan in Cairo. I don't know whether any of you have seen it before. It's a Mamluk mosque and a school. It's supposedly called the fourth pyramid of Egypt, one of the most wonderful mosques in the whole world, if not the most beautiful. According to architecture experts, it's basically the most beautiful mosque in the world. However, I have never seen it before, and entering the mosque and sort of trying to understand, I had a very strange feeling of belonging, and also a kind of feeling of being overwhelmed and wanting to understand more. I asked the people around me, who's this Sultan Hassan and what did he do? And they told me that he's someone who spent all his money building this mosque, and then he died. He was killed at the age of 27 and was never buried there. So it's a kind of frustrating story. But then I said, what time was it? And they told me it's the time of the Mamluks. Again, the Mamluks, unfortunately, we think about in Egypt as these are the slaves that were ruling us, and they were really harsh, and they were foreigners, and which is completely not true. I started reading about the Mamluks for 3 years, started to understand more about who these people actually are and what they are doing. While reading, I discovered that the architect who built the mosque of Sultan Hassan, his name was hidden for centuries and centuries until 1945. Do you imagine? Like, no one actually knew who built that. 1945, another architect discovered a writing in one of the schools inside the mosque with the name of the architect. And the name of the architect was written very clearly, obviously because he's someone who was very important and also thought of this work as his life achievement. This story in itself made me, again, very moved. So I thought I'm going to write a novel about the architect, about this architect who decided to build the mosque. But during that, I wanted to know about his surroundings, his parents, life in Egypt at the time. Who are these Mamluks? The idea that as a child, you're actually kidnapped as a child and taken to another country, and you're brought into another religion, you're trained to become a warrior, and possibly you know that you will not live beyond the age of 50. Most of them didn't. Because you're a warrior, you're going to be killed, at war, in a kind of another struggle, a political struggle, but you will be killed eventually. So this was very kind of sad, but also fascinating story for me. I wanted to understand more about these people. I wanted to understand their own mentality. So that's how I wrote my Mamluk trilogy. I'm just going to share with you the cover. It has been published in English by Syracuse University Press. The Mamluk trilogy tells the story of the beginning of the Mamluks, and then what happened during the middle times of the Mamluks. They have ruled Egypt for about 300 years, exactly 267 years. And what happened to this mosque throughout the times? The beginning, the mosque was built by this architect, and we see the architect and we see the creation behind this. And then after that, we see what happened to the mosque when it became a place for war, a place where people actually were struggling together at war, so that they can at war together, so that and what happened to this mosque at the time. And then the last part of the novel is the raiding and theft that happened at the mosque when the Ottomans entered Egypt, which is a true story, that they somehow stole certain parts from the citadel and mosques in Egypt. So this was sort of a story within a framework of another story. The other framework was about the other architect, the one in 1945, who discovered, the architect who built Sultan Hassan Mosque. I was interested also in this person because this person found a very big discovery in a way. So the story was revolving around this architect who's writing about the Mamluks, and he's giving his story to his granddaughter. His granddaughter is half Italian, half Egyptian, never lived in Egypt. She comes back to her grandfather, finds that he's giving her a vase, a Murano vase from Venetia, and also the story. Josephine, who's actually the granddaughter, somehow learns so much about history, same like I did in a way, but she also learns in the meantime about humanity, about love, about struggles that we all have, about the idea that sometimes we have inside us hate, envy, greed, love, all the feelings, all the human feelings. So I want to sort of end, I know we don't have that much time, so I want to end by reading perhaps the last section when Josephine was thinking about all the stories that she has read that her grandfather left her. In the last part of the story, Josephine, Dr. Salah's granddaughter, discovered her goal. Tales of defeat stimulate life, not death. They touch the heart and remind it of the final stage. Loneliness was firmly settled inside her. All persons, human beings as a whole, were part of her experience. And yet, it was still meager, with no horsemen or invasions, a modest experience of a journey with loneliness and defeat. She knows Emir Muhammad and Zainab, Amr and Daifa, Salar and Hind. They are all still friends who engage with loneliness and inspire a feeling of confidence that her story is not unique and her destiny is not unusual. She realized that love stories help bring about a spirit of harmony, if only for a while. They can convince people that death is not the end and life is not the goal. A certain amount of sympathy and affection can be found within the vicissitudes of time. Josephine did not find the serenity of love during her journey and came to realize that she never would find it. Amid the upheavals of time, occasions when spirits coalesce are rare indeed. They deserve contemplation and a written record. The harsh defeat is something that we can get used and adapt to, just like bloodshed during wars. Sorrow has a dark hue that can obscure the sun, but it can be pierced by moments of total harmony between lovers. It illuminates the heart with lanterns that cannot be stolen. A sense of security resides in history. After it is read, no catastrophe can shock and no triumph can encourage boasting. It is what happened and what is over. She has now told what happened, or she has tried. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I will not be able to be here for the next hour because I have the formal launch of my new novel, Al-Halawani, and that's going to be very difficult to translate in English. I don't know whether I'm going to say the cake maker or the sweet maker, halawani. Perhaps that's something for for you to think about later on. But thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem, and good luck once again, and congratulations to you. So we will now move to Alice. So Alice Guthrie is an independent translator, editor, and curator specializing in contemporary Arabic writing. Her work often focuses on the subaltern voices, activist art, and she won a number of prizes, including the 2019 Jules Kamitsky Translation Prize. She programmed Shabak Festival between 2015 and 2019 and has curated events for the Edinburgh International Book Festival, Arts Canteen, as well as other festivals. Alice teaches translation at the University of Exeter and University of Birmingham in the UK, and it's a pleasure to have her with us. Alice, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Abdel-Wahab, and thanks everyone for being here. And it's lovely to be on this panel and to see lots of known names in the audience. So I'm actually going to put a timer on for myself because I know that we're supposed to be being on it with time. And yeah, I wanted to kind of try to do a bit of an overview of some aspects of some of the developments and challenges that have happened in recent years. I want to say in advance that I wish my thoughts were a bit more organised. It's a very, very busy week for me, so we'll see. I'm going to try and be as coherent as I can. I've got some notes here. Hopefully you'll stay with me. Okay, so, it's my fault if you don't, is what I mean. Okay, so something that I wanted to kind of look at in a bit of a general way and then zoom in a bit more on the kind of Arabic to English literary translation scene in a minute. I wanted to kind of start by just acknowledging that in the last, say, 10 years, there's been a bit of a shift really in the literary translation scene in general in the UK. I mean, everything that I'm saying today is mainly UK based, but you know, there's not that much separation really between UK and US publishing. And I personally probably get more work published in the US, but yeah, we're kind of thinking about the UK, I guess. And so there's been this certain amount of, as you probably all know, kind of, I would even almost go so far as to say a kind of translator cool has come in the last, say, 10 years. Certainly that's what translators will tell you anyway. And certain people in kind of, you know, literary media. To what extent it's kind of filtered out any further than that, I don't know. But there's, I think, something that goes quite hand in hand with the hype around literary translation. So there's like, by which I mean, you know, more events, bit more coverage, bit more funding, although not so much for Arabic to English, but in general, a bit more funding, bit more infrastructure. Something that seems to go hand in hand with that rather is a kind of what I would call like a sort of translator fragility, which is a bit of a kind of, you know, lots of claims to excellence by us and a bit of, you know, defensiveness about kind of why don't they read us more and why isn't translated lit read more? And, you know, some of us would say, well, maybe it's not all massively good, you know, but there's a bit of fragility around that. And, you know, literally, so despite this kind of bit of a boom, bit of a new visibility for literary translation, it does remain, as it always was, really a quintessentially solo craft, right? I mean, no one, you know, can follow us into the text, really, not into both texts, you know, like neither the reader, the writer, or usually the editor. And so we're kind of on our own in there a lot. And I think that that's maybe a bit of a funny thing that needs interrogating more. And the other thing that really is linked to that, and that has always been the case and still is that we're still invisible, right? So the classic kind of, you know, the fight for translator visibility, the hashtag name the translator and all of that. We are still very much invisible. And what happens as a result, or what is part of that, is that, you know, no one really knows what we do. So we can't really rely on others or kind of outsiders to evaluate our work or help us improve it. And so, you know, I would argue that in an ideal world, our claims to this kind of badass status would lead us to having rigor and critique and kind of best practice in our field, you know, like, because if we're as amazing as we claim we are, then why not get into that, and why not, you know, dig in deeper? And so I think bilingual editorial work or capacity is really, really key in that attempt in our context. And I think that we could see this, and many of these thoughts are from conversations with my colleagues. I mean, it's not all mine. So I think that we could really see this as a form of taking care of ourselves and each other. Wow, time goes quick if you actually time it. Yeah, and so sort of seeing accountability as a form of support. So not really, I'm not really talking about policing standards, but it's more like mutually holding each other to certain standards, learning from each other, fixing each other's mistakes, a bit like how in an ideal kind of workplace team type scenario, which most of us translators don't know anything about because we're always on our own. Okay, so to zoom in a bit more onto Arabic, I mean, it's funny because the brief was kind of look at, trends and developments. And obviously, I just want to flag that one of the amazing trends that I could be talking about here is the kind of blossoming of queerness in culture since the Arab Spring. And I'm not going into that, but I just want to do a tip of my hat to that. What I want to kind of think about for a few minutes is so a bit more recently than the translator movement I was talking about, in the last maybe sort of 3 or so years, the notion of decolonizing as an intellectual concept has kind of come into the mainstream a bit more. It's getting, we hope, a bit popularized, right? And so there's some brilliant thinking and writing going on about decolonizing literary translation. Anyone who hasn't checked out the recent Tilted Axis anthology, Violent Phenomena, I really urge you to check that out. And, obviously this intersects, I don't need to explain, I guess to you guys, this intersects with Black Lives Matter and so on in the last couple of years. So what does this mean kind of for us in Arabic to English literary translation? Well, and some of you will have heard me say this before over the years, but I think that we're in a really special situation with Arabic to English, because I think we have a kind of perfect storm, really, between, on the one hand, the linguistic cultural effects of Orientalism. So, I think that what Orientalism has kind of baked in so far to this language pair is the idea that Arabic is a kind of unintelligible Eastern code, that can be kind of approximated only, really. And so approximations are accepted and maybe even expected, and tropes as well are really demanded. And the perfect storm is that meets kind of what I would say are private school intellectual patterns around not saying when we don't know or we don't understand. And, I think we've all witnessed this with our politicians in recent years, right, who went to those same schools. We know that the only data that we have is not specific to translators, but it's specific to the publishing sector. We know that 20% of people who work in publishing went to fee-paying schools. I think that's about 4 times the number in the wider population. I would say anecdotally, it seems like, probably over half of literary translators went to fee-paying schools. And, you could say that's a great education. But I think it does probably suggest quite a strong patterning for some of these, colonial patterns that we're trying to remove and decolonize. And I guess also in the storm is that we have so little specific funding for this pair. For this language pair, so that who can afford to do the work, there's a class thing. And yeah, my time is going quite quickly, actually. Let me just see if I can say what I wanted to say. So I think what I wanted to emphasize a bit was that when we think about decolonizing, we obviously, and I have to make sure that I say that, be clear about this as a white person. We're talking about whiteness, we're talking about white supremacy. But what are the other intersections that actually hold up, these oppressive patterns and systems? The intersections, obviously, with whiteness are also, cisgender and ability and being hetero and class, right, and resources. There's a lot of socioeconomic element to what holds these redundant, I would say, or not so useful old patterns in place culturally. And so I think that bilingual editing input is a really key plank in decolonizing Arabic to English, because if we have bilingual editorial input, as is starting to happen, quite a few presses and venues are starting to do that, and more I think will follow gradually, we get to really unpick some of this stuff. And I mean, I I guess it bears saying that, you know, I'm in Bristol, I live in Bristol, and we learnt with the Colston statue that, like, you know, no matter how many articles were written about it, it took ropes, and people had to buy those ropes and grappling hooks to actually pull it down. I'm not saying that pulling down the statue, you know, solved things in my city, but it was a great day. So if we see that as a kind of metaphor for decolonizing culturally, then someone's got to, you know, buy the ropes, which I would say is like funding and grants, and then somebody's got to actually have the technique to say, okay, what's going on here? Like, you know, how has this been translated, and how could it be done better? Not in a kind of, I really don't mean this in a negative way. I mean it in the most loving, positive way. You know, I love Arabic literature and I want to see it lifted up, and I love translation and I want to see it lifted up. And I want us to kind of get a bit more robust and braver and sort of prove that we're the badasses that we claim to be. So yeah, I mean, yeah, a practical way, my notes say that the privilege needs to be interrogated at a textual level. So that's what I think, you know, bilingual editing at its best can do. Well, that's the end of my 10 minutes, I think, nearly. There's so much else that I could have, you know, almost a bit that I could still have said. I haven't sort of told you about my own work, but I think we'll leave that for the Q and A, you know, the discussion, the Q&A and stuff. I'll just hold up my book, since we were told to flag our work in some way. And yeah, if you want to ask me questions about how whiteness or resources play out in that, I can answer. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here.
Thank you so much, Alice. Great stuff. Now we move on to Yussef. So Yussef El-Guindi is an award-winning playwright who was born in Egypt, raised in London, and now based in Seattle in the US. His work frequently examines the collision of ethnicities, cultures, and politics that face Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. Among the awards and honors he won are the Middle East America Distinguished Playwright Award and the American Theatre Critics Association's New Play Award. Yussef is currently a core company playwright member at ACT Theatre in Seattle and a resident artist at Golden Thread Production. Yussef, a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. I timed my essay, reading it, and it came to 8 minutes, 12 seconds. So I have 1 minute, 48 seconds to set this up. Yeah, so I'm primarily a playwright. And yes, born in Egypt, raised in England, left England when I was 23. Actually, I left to go to American University in Cairo, and then came to do my graduate studies in the States, and I've been here ever since. So my focus has been on plays and playwriting, and the struggle has been about getting plays produced. Publication, yes, but the first effort always is to get the play produced and then subsequently published. So this essay I want to read, it's more on an author's note to a collection of short plays that were recently published of mine. It's called In a Clear, Concise Arabic Tongue. I know it's backwards. It's not an academic essay. It was written in some heat when I wrote it. So it's just my personal musings on the state of accessibility for Arab Middle Eastern stories. So let me just quickly launch into it so I don't go over my time. Okay. So imagine a dystopia where you, a theater practitioner, someone who loves theater, never see yourself represented on any stage anywhere. You do see monstrous distortions of yourself in Hollywood and Western movies that makes you sink in your seat in shame, embarrassment, and later when remembering, go into little fugue states of rage, because rage usually happens when you feel powerless and don't know how to respond to a relentless, dehumanizing venom unspooled at 24 frames per second. In theatre land, on the other hand, there is no representation. Nobody of your ilk is present to be misrepresented. No Arabs, Muslims, or Middle Eastern people occupy any part of the stage you're drawn to. In this profession that purports to be a truth teller, a reflection of the world we live in, you are not seen, heard, or acknowledged in any way. I'm sure someone might point to some appearance in the pre-2000s, but that would fall under the category of few and far between and too inconsequential to create any kind of cultural impact. But here's the thing. After years of ingesting this venom and void, the state of cultural invisibility wasn't even felt as a condition because there was no expectation for visibility. Even for someone as sensitive to representation as I was, I didn't truly believe my stories belonged up there on the big stages. That was where the angst and humor, the drama and comic foibles of a certain demographic played out, not my demographic. Why would my demographic belong up there on those big stages? Such is the all-enveloping cultural aesthetics of this dystopia that even I believe that my stories of Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterners only belonged, if they were to exist at all, way out in the fringiest of fringe theaters. This lack of expectation on my part couldn't even be considered as some kind of self-abnegation or loathing. There was no assembled self to loathe. A communal self is created in the stories a community shares with each other, about each other. And since I saw no representation of myself anywhere in my profession, I hadn't yet, in a cultural sense, been created. In this dystopia, I had become a well-conditioned, good little theatre practitioner who didn't know he could complain about the state of affairs. I didn't know I could push back and address the gatekeepers of theatre with their deep indifference, even antipathy, to all things Arab, Muslim, and Middle Eastern. And if I had had the wherewithal to speak up back then, I knew they could ignore me with no consequences. We had no cultural warriors in our corner. We weren't a constituency that had to be addressed. As I said, we were almost beyond the category of invisibility. Again, you first have to have a persistent presence to be ignored and rendered invisible. And the wider culture didn't even know we existed three-dimensionally enough to be pushed aside and ignored. On the day I finally got on the internet in 1999, I typed in Arab American theater and found 2 or 3 organizations that specialized in my kind of stories. 2 of those, the Arab Theatrical Arts Guild, and later, and with greater impact on my work, Golden Thread Productions, responded to my inquiries. The earliest of these pieces in this collection, an adaptation of Chekhov's A Marriage Proposal, was done in February 2001 in Dearborn, Michigan, at the Arab Theatrical Arts Guild. This Chekhov piece with its universal themes of family, marriage, and argument is often adapted by different groups. Inserting Arabs into this play became a delicious and truly radical act of counter-programming for me. Here we goddamn are was the motif playing in my head as I adapted this work. And here's the thing. Throughout the various productions I've had of different short and full-length plays, I've noted that certain critics will critique my plays for having a political agenda, which is apparently a no-no, but that's a different discussion. When I rarely ever have an agenda of any kind when writing a play, except when writing satires, which by their very nature have particular social and political targets in mind. But in the simple act of rendering a formally vilified and culturally absent group three-dimensionally, this very act of humanizing is seen as a political act, which it is in a way, but not for the reasons they mean. An innocuous, non-political family matter would be seen as having a political agenda because representing a formerly unseen group a formerly unseen group of people in a way that makes them appear human is seen as a shrill act of political activism. Even some of the most overtly political pieces here, like the monologist suffers her monologue, is radical primarily because it gives voice to a character from a group that has repeatedly been silenced and ignored in American theater. Or in the case of So Unlike Me and The Sniper, to sentiments and ideas that aren't often given voice in mainstream theater. Giving voice, rendering a formerly flattened and despised people when thought of at all, three-dimensionally, and daring to want to occupy a little of that center stage, all these ordinary and basic acts become slapped with those much maligned political didactic labels. People who walk into a space formerly denied them will, by their very entrance, be seen as protesters protesting something. It's the luxury to be above politics and the societal forces at play in a country. Not everyone can ignore the actions of governments, institutions, or people you might come across who express their prejudices either unabashedly or conceal them in facts and figures and concern for your people's problematic, read backward culture. For those who can't ignore any of that, even if they wanted to, then all things domestic are bent towards the outside forces shaping their lives, i.e. the political. Your personal life becomes shaped by the stereotypes people have of you, again, as expressed either by government policy or by ordinary citizens whose prejudices don't allow you to continue your day as planned. So to dramatize all this in a play is actually to speak of domestic matters, because politics at that point is in your very personal churning gut and in your very high blood pressure. You may want art to explore only existential concerns or some universal themes like love, anger, ambition, etc., or dabble in the hijinks and low points of the human condition, etc. And all these short pieces do that to some degree or another. But they also widen the frame and place their characters in the social and political context in which they operate. This, to me, is a more complete picture of the human condition. The political animal is the domestic animal, is the human animal. It's not a case of one thing or the other. So, to the gatekeepers and the critics who dismiss these pieces and others like mine as no more than political activism, ignoring everything else about them, and to all those who want to return to the old programming, please, with all due respect, retire. But here's the other thing. I did not see myself represented on stage in the US or the UK, where I was raised, until my 40s. To repeat, not until my 40s did I see any meaningful representation of Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterns on stage. It took an accumulation of these kinds of short and full-length plays during the 2000s by myself and others to counter that particular void and insult. That's it. That was the essay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yussef.
Thank you
great stuff.
for listening.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. And now we move on to Professor Wen-chin Ouyang. Wen-chin is a professor of Arabic and comparative literature at SOAS, University of London. And before she moved to London, she taught at Columbia, Chicago, and Virginia universities in the US. Author of many academic works, Wen-chin is the editor-in-chief of Middle Eastern Literatures and the member of the editorial board of Bulletin of SOAS, as well as the Middle East to London magazine. She also contributes regularly to Bani Pal. Wen-chin, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Could someone sort of share my PowerPoint? That would be really nice. And thank you so much for having me, and Hanem and Abdel-Wahab for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be in the present company and to be part of this panel. So from the, I can't see my PowerPoint, if someone can upload it so I can remind myself of what I want to say. So from any
I'm opening it as we speak. So
yeah, well, anytime. So from the sort of the any introduction that you hear about me, you hear this academic CV, right? What I have done, what I have published academically or in terms of research. So I want to be able to introduce myself a little bit. am I allowed to sort of move this?
I'm happy to do that for you. So
yeah, okay. So I might not remember which slide, by the way. Might not sort of like know the other parts of me that that are involved in languages, multilingualism, and translation. But having heard from everyone on the panel, I'm going to sort of shift our side a little bit, not in the direction of creative writing or creative translation, but look at the role of Arabic translation and the vicissitudes of its fortune in teaching and research. But before I do that, let me introduce myself. If Abdel-Wahab could move to the next slide. So who am I, right? What are the languages that I know well, right? And these are three. I'm multilingual, I'm a trilingual in Arabic, Chinese, and English, but I'm an Arabist who teaches Arabic literature at SOAS within Arabic studies and cultural studies, comparative literature, and post-colonial studies. And as a supervisor of doctoral projects, I do look after translation studies, but within comparative literature, not within linguistics. I use translations for research purposes, but I do not translate professionally or engage with translation studies as such. I'm an avid reader of translation of literary works in all three languages, but I am an amateur translator. I translate for friendship and have been known to support translators engaged with translating Arabic literary works into English. This doesn't mean that I do not have projects for translation in the future, and I have quite a few of them. One is the novel by Abdel-Wahab. I translated one chapter, and I'd like to be able to finish that, and he's an Iraqi author. And the other translation project is actually a part of my research, and that's a classical text, 13th century text by Ibn Jawzi called Dhamm al-Hawa, or In Censure of Passion. But as any academic would tell you, and you have seen also in the examples of many of my colleagues, we academics who have to publish for the purposes of promotion and ref, for example, we save our translation projects until our retirement. So these translation projects will be for my retirement. All right, next project. But I have been, yes, next slide, please. Just very quickly, I have been involved in a number of projects that involve translation. The first is Library of Arabic Literature. Next slide. And Banipal, of course, and I don't sort of like submit translations. I mean, if Samuel and Maggie asked me to translate something, I would do it for them. The next one would be Middle Eastern literatures. Again, when I was editor-in-chief, and I no longer am, I've handed it over to a young generation of scholars, and I understand they continue to encourage translation, publishing translations of Middle Eastern literatures. So when I was editor, I sort of published or translated in order to fill certain gaps in translation submissions. Next slide. And most recently, I translated for Friendship Heifat Zengane's short stories. And it came out last year, I believe, and the title is called Packaged Lives. And these are stories, short stories, and pieces selected from 4 collections of her short stories. The next slide, please. And I have been involved in prizes, judging book prizes or prizes, literary prizes that involve translation, Man Booker International, the Saif Ghobash Translation Prize, and of course, British Comparative Literature Association's Translation Prize. I have a feeling that I'm no longer on the committee. The next one. Next slide, please. And now, sort of, I want to sort of like very quickly sum up sort of where I see translation from Arabic in this case, because we are talking about the US and UK institutions of higher education. So we're looking at translation from Arabic and the role of it in our teaching. So we now like use translation in modules on Arabic literature taught in English, even at SOAS, or on modules on Arabic writings in which existing translations serve as means of understanding, let's say, the Arabic text, right? And translation is useful, right? It plays a key role in research on Arabic literature, but more particularly on word literature, comparative literature, and translation studies. Especially with the sort of rise of word literature in research and also in academic curriculum, right? Translation has become, translated literary works are becoming increasingly important in teaching and research. Next slide, please. Right, so if I can sum up the development between 1982, when I started my graduate studies at Columbia University, and today, 2022, in the US and UK, and Hanem, I'm expanding sort of the time frame that you gave us. So this period covers about 40 years, right? We can see, right, in teaching the growth in the market of Arabic translation or translation of Arabic literary works, and the growth of the share in curriculum, not only in word literature and comparative literature, but also in Arabic literature. I mean, and this is, right, related to the decline in modern languages as a subject. And even at SOAS today, with the slowdown of our Arabic teaching, our students, right, are no longer as capable of reading Arabic text in the original today. And quite often we use translation to help, right? And translation, of course, has always been in the service to area studies, right? And in terms of research, you know, there is a little bit of a different picture going on here, right? So we have moved, right, from area studies, or translation in area studies, to translation studies. So from using translation as a part of, right, the study of areas, geographical areas, to now studying translation for its own sake in translation studies. But within that, right, we can see the fluctuating value of translation from between the earlier days when translations were valued for themselves to about sort of like about a period between probably 90s and early 21st century, when translation did not count as research, and up to most recently, probably in the past 5 or 6 years, when translation is now counted as research. So, for example, translation can be submitted to the ref exercise these days, and it is taken seriously. Right? But more important, in the field of comparative literature and translation studies, we see the move from accuracy of translation, right? Source text and target text, whether the target text gets the source text, to translation as a form of creativity, right? So this is discussion of translation from Arabic primarily into English in the US and UK market. And if you go down to the next slide, which is my final one, but as a speaker of Chinese as well, and having been engaging with scholars in China who also translate, right, as part of their research, Arabic works and Arabic literature in Chinese, I am, right, inspired to think about a more global view and vision of translation. And through this vision and view, can we make better sense of the reach of Arabic literature in the rest of the world, right? So how do we bring translation of Arabic literature into other European languages, and also into other Asian, African, and Middle Eastern languages, into, right, considerations of the proliferation, reach, and influence of Arabic literature in the world. So thank you very much. This is all what I have to say for now.
Thank you so much, Wen-chin. If I may take the floor just for 5 minutes or so, I'll be giving you a brief summary of a study that Alexandra Buchler and I did, which is an update of a study that Alice and Alexandra did, actually. So in the one that we have recently published, it kind of covered the period between 2010 until 2020, but also the bibliography that we have covered covers 2021. So I'll be very brief. I just want to show a few of the graphs and the things that we have done. So if you just give me a second to share my screen. So I hope you can all see this. So it's basically about Arabic literature and English translation, and I would like to show you the graphs that we have done. So I've done a bibliography of Arabic literature, things that have been translated and published since 2010 up until the end of 2021 to the best of my ability. It took an awful lot of time, and it's usually work that is not refable, for instance, like for it doesn't give you academic brownies, and it's not really something that you get a lot of credit for. And therefore, I've been working on a project called El-Dalil. So El-Dalil is a website that will be published hopefully end of this year, and it will be a bibliography of Arabic literature in translation, all languages into, so from Arabic into all languages, and hopefully will be out very soon. So part of the studies that Alexandra edited, it kind of covered a spectrum of languages, and all these bibliographies that were done as part of these studies will be fed into are actually now being fed into the bibliography. So it's something to look out for, and hopefully there will be an announcement about this as soon as it's out. When we talk about Arabic literature and also the bibliography that I have done, it's worth noting that works that have been published originally or written in English originally are not considered as part of the study. This doesn't mean that they do not fit the criteria of Arabic literature. And I actually like the way Banipal kind of puts it. So they speak of Arab literature instead of Arabic literature, so as not to exclude those that write in English. So, but just this note is to say that all the numbers that you will see are for works that were originally written in Arabic and published in English translations. So we actually have healthy numbers. So over 500 translations in the last 10 years or 11 years alone. It doesn't mean that the visibility and reach of Arabic literature has changed. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have. We see a lot of reviews in a bit, mainstream journals and places, but not really much. So there are not many reviews of things, at least to the best of our knowledge and the things that we have researched as part of the study. You will see that in 2020, we have the lowest number, and it's probably due to the pandemic. And then we have between 2014 up to 2018, a large number of publications, and it's quite possibly relevant to the refugee crisis, because there was the climax years of the refugee crisis, and also Arabs coming to, a lot of Arabs coming to Europe, etc. And I actually like this graph, which shows an evolution of the translations of Arabic literature since 2010. And you will see that there are many spikes whenever there is a political or geopolitical event in the Arab world. So in countries like Iraq, Egypt, Palestine, etc. So whenever there is a many spike, you see a spike in the number of, whenever there is a political event, you see a spike in the number of translations. And I don't know what happened there. I hope that you can still see the slides. Can you still see that? So what is getting published in translation? Okay, that's good. So about the genres, what gets published. Fiction still takes the largest space. So 301 translations in the last 11 years. And that is followed by poetry. which is actually has risen the number of translations since the last update that Alice and Alexandra did. So who is being published in translation? Who are the authors that get published in translation? Naguib Mahfouz still sits as the main person that gets translated for obvious reasons. And then there are other Arab authors that get translated. And one of the things that we should celebrate is that we see more of women writers getting translated in English. And the countries, the geographical representation, Egypt has always been the dominant kind of player in terms of who are the authors that get translated. But it's now followed by countries like Iraq and Palestine and Syria. And you will see, if you look at the numbers prior to the what we call the Arab Spring, actually these countries had very few translations. And then after that date, the number of translations spiked. And that goes back to the evolution kind of graph that I showed earlier. As I said, we have more female authors, but still predominantly male authors. And the mixed graph here is when there are short story collections or poetry anthologies where you have both male and female authors, etc. And unknown is that we are not really sure because the authors were anonymous or we couldn't identify, etc. And the top 10 women authors, as you can see, Noel Saadawi still is the highest translator author. And we see new names coming up as well, as you can see on the graph. I'm going quite quickly, but you can go to the study if you'd like to have more information about the names. So who's publishing translations from Arabic? Who are the publishers, not just in the UK, but in worldwide? Who publishes Arabic literature in translation? So American University in Cairo is still the dominant player. I'm not sure, it looks a bit, I'm not sure if you can read that, but then followed by New York University Press and others in the US as well as in the UK. And because the study was mainly about the UK and Ireland, we have the top 10 UK publishers per output. So the publishers that published more during the last decade or 11 years is Seagull Books. But we also have new publishers coming in, like Comma Press, Bloomsbury Publishing, Saqi, Bani Pal, Daft Publishers, and others. So the geographical representation in terms of the number of outputs per region, in terms of the translations. So the US produces more translations than any other country or region. And that is followed by the UK, and there are translations that were published in the Arab world. And to note here that the American University in Cairo, because it's based in Cairo, it was included in the Arab world, but outside of that spectrum, you'd actually add it to the US, but the Arab governments, not much is coming out of this side, which is something I think that we need to pay attention for. So who translates Arabic literature? The translators. So back in the day, we had predominantly male translators, white translators. Now the translator community is quite diverse in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of everything pretty much, which is something to celebrate really. So you see more women translators as well as male translators, but still predominantly male translators, at least as far as the number tells us. But we see a rise in the number of female translators, which is a thing to celebrate. So the gender representation as for the translators, it's as you can see here. So it's male, female, and still the male is quite dominant, but then the female's catching up, which is a great thing. So these are the top 10 translators in the past decade or 11 years, and they are predominantly male, but there are female ones as well. And I have to say that the numbers here are kind of affected by the self-publishing, which is a trend that we kind of saw rising when we were doing the bibliography. So a lot of people self-translate and self-publish, and that actually have a negative impact on the field from where I stand, because the quality of these translations are not always the best. And then if a reader kind of takes that translation, buys it, and they start reading it, it's not going to give them the best representation about Arabic literature. Also, I feel not all of them are like that, but the majority of them are. So women translators with most outputs, these are them, and that's pretty much it. And I'd be happy to take questions, but we'll